We encounter interviews frequently. When you listen to your favorite radio station, the program host may be interviewing the director of a non-profit organization. When you listen to the news, the reporter may be interviewing an athlete who just clocked the fastest time for that event. Interviewing for a job, whether as an interviewer or as an interviewee, may also be an activity with which you are familiar. In this lecture, we will consider how interviews are communicative activities, a few common types of interviews, and the basic structure and components of interviews. Many of us are nervous about interviews. Fortunately, interviewing is a skill that we can learn and improve. Authors Amsbury and Powell defined interviewing as a process of purposeful interaction involving two parties and which involves the asking and answering of questions. First, interviews are purposeful interactions because each party participates with the intention of achieving his or her goals. In a job interview situation, the interviewee seeks to get the job offer, while the interviewer seeks to identify the best candidate for his or her company. Second, interviews are dyadic because they involve two parties. Sometimes, interviews are one-on-one. Other times, a few individuals may represent a party. And third, interviews are about asking and answering of questions. Interviewing is an information exchange activity. Now that we have surveyed the three key components of an interview, let's now take a look at one category of interviews known as workplace interviews. You are probably most familiar with employment interviews, which is also known as job interviews or work interviews. Organizations use employment interviews to screen applicants to evaluate whether or not to hire them. Employment interviews are also used for information gathering. Another type of workplace interviews is the performance review interview. It is also known as the appraisal interview. Many organizations conduct performance review interviews to evaluate how their workers are performing, identify workers' areas for improvement if there are any, allow organizations to express their level of satisfaction with their workers' work, and for employers and employees to focus on future performance. A third type of workplace interviews that you might know of is the exit interview. Organizations use exit interviews to understand why their employees are leaving. It is also used by organizations to learn what they could have done differently. Let us now consider four key stages of most interviews. The first stage is preparation. During this stage, parties consider their respective strengths and weaknesses. This stage helps the parties to think about how to achieve their goals through the interview. The second stage is the opening. For many interviews, the opening is the initial contact between the parties. Thus, those initial exchanges can determine the rest of the interview. The third stage is the question and answer stage. In this stage, the interviewer asks questions to which the interviewee will answer or respond. For some interviews, the roles can switch, especially in the fourth stage. The fourth stage is known as closing. For example, when a physician asks a patient about her medical history, the physician is the interviewer while the patient is the interviewee. But the physician may subsequently ask the patient if she has any questions for him. If the patient does have questions to ask the physician, the interviewer-interviewee roles will change or switch. As another example for the closing stage, parties may know that the interview is about to end based on the predetermined time allocated for the interaction. For example, Jane is the hiring manager of a position at her company. She contacted one of the applicants, James, to schedule a 30-minute phone interview. Thus, both of them will have an idea that the interview will end within 30 minutes. However, it's preferable that interviews conclude not only because they are keeping within the allocated time, but also because both parties have gathered the information that they need, and that the interaction has helped them to move closer to achieving their respective goals. The interviewer's verbal skills can help interviewees express information that the interviewer needs for the purposes of the interview. Open-ended questions such as, when did you learn that you enjoy talking with people, encourage interviewees to speak freely. On the other hand, closed-ended questions such as, did you complete the degree, solicit shorter replies. Interviewing is also a skill that we can learn because it involves listening. Effective listening is to accurately understand what the interviewee or the other party articulates to the interviewer. To confirm the accuracy of what the interviewer heard, it would be helpful for the interviewer to paraphrase or check that he or she has made the correct perceptions. There are three common question sequences used in interviews. The first sequence is the funnel sequence. In the funnel sequence, the interviewer starts by asking broad questions before proceeding to specific questions. By taking this approach, the interviewer directs the discussion gradually toward a specific topic. The second type of sequence is the inverted funnel, which is the reverse of the earlier process. This approach begins with the interviewer asking short, specific questions and gradually toward broader questions. The inverted funnel sequence is useful to stimulate responses from non-talkative interviewees. Those specific questions also serve well as an icebreaker to get interviewees to talk freely. The third sequence is the tunnel sequence. This sequence uses a series of similar questions of the same format. The tunnel sequence is effective when the interviewer needs to cover a number of different topics, but in-depth information on those topics is not necessary. The types of interview questions include open-ended questions, closed-ended questions, and probes. Interviewers use open-ended questions to encourage interviewees to use their own words in their responses. The interviewee can discuss the topic from his or her own perspective. Tell me about yourself is a classic example of an open-ended question. In contrast, closed-ended questions include those that ask for yes-no answers, such as, have you ever worked in the fast food industry before? Interviewers may use closed-ended questions to seek clarification or to know a specific piece of information. And finally, probes are follow-up questions to get more information, such as, tell me more about that. Interviewers may use silence, like a probe, to encourage interviewees to continue talking. Interviewers may apply empathic listening skills to monitor what their interviewees are saying. Some of the techniques include paraphrasing, requesting clarification, and checking perceptions. Paraphrasing is to restate a response using one's own words. Interviewers may also request clarification in the form of more details or an example. As for perception checking, it is a chance for interviewee to verify the accuracy of the interviewer's impression of what the interviewee has said. The final interviewing technique that we will that we will discuss is feedback. Feedback allows interviewees to know whether their interviewers understood what they had said. How are interviews structured? The topic sequence interview mainly uses open-ended questions to encourage interviewees to talk. Common examples of such interview structure are employment interviews and oral history interviews. Next, the guided interview is one where the interviewer directs the interviewee toward a predetermined topic. This is often observed in journalistic and television interviews. Focus group discussions are also a form of guided interview, where the trained interviewer works from a discussion guide. The third type of structure is the standardized quantitative interview, which is the most structured of interview. It is often used in survey research and heavily uses closed questions. We have so far considered the verbal aspects of interviews from the perspectives of both the interviewer and interviewee. However, nonverbal cues also reveal information for both parties. Handshakes are a common type of touching in the interviewing process. A handshake may disclose how an interview or individual is feeling about the interview. Silence, as discussed earlier, can be used to encourage further discussion, yet it can also create awkwardness and make interviewees feel uncomfortable. Maintaining eye contact and smiling are ways that interviewers show that they are listening. Together with body movements such as head nods, those non-verbal cues underscore the interest that the interviewer has in learning about the interviewee's perspective. Artifacts such as clothing can show how well prepared the interviewee is and whether the interviewee knows the culture of the organization, particularly in the hiring context. In terms of territory and space, interviews that take place at the hiring organization can often give interviewees an idea of what might be important to that organization. Vocalics refers to how individuals use their voice, such as speaking loudly or softly. And finally, the use of time also demonstrates the importance placed on the interview by both parties. It can also symbolically show who has more power in that situation. To recap this chapter, interviewing is a purposeful interaction involving two parties and the asking and answering of questions. It is purposeful interaction in that each of the participants engages in the interview with a purpose. It involves two parties, but either or both parties may be composed of one or more people. And the asking and answering of questions is the framework in which information is exchanged within the interaction.